Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Best Series Finales of all time. In this video, I will count down my top 10 favorite final episodes of my favorite shows. So this is the second part of a two-part series. In the first part, I covered my top 10 worst series finales. So if you haven't checked that video out, you can check that out. If you want to be more negative, but I'm being more positive in this video where I'm talking about my favorite final episodes of my favorite shows. So, same kind of disclaimers I made in the previous video. Obviously, I would have need to see the show. If there's a show missing from this list you think deserves there's a chance that it's because I never saw that show. Like The Sopranos, even though a lot of people hate it, some people love it. But stuff like that, never seen. I think, what's the other one that's really popular? 6 Feet Under. That's everyone says it's amazing, but I've never seen it. I don't know. So, yes. And the most obvious disclaimer in the world, I really shouldn't have to make this, but I do. This is all my opinion. I'm not saying this is objective truth or any BS like that. It's just my opinion, man. It's just what I think, my own personal point of view. I don't take popular opinion into account because fuck popular opinion. I'm sorry, but really, why would you want to watch a video about popular opinion? This is just my opinion. What my personal favorite top 10 final episodes of final shows or whatever of shows that I like. Also, another thing that should be obvious, spoiler warning. Because I'm talking about the final episodes of the entire show. So, if I get to a show on my countdown you have not seen, which you will know because there will be a picture of the show and I'll say the name of the show, you can immediately mute the video or skip past that part. If you don't want to be spoiled, if it's a show you haven't seen yet and you want to see someday in the future, so you don't want to be spoiled, then that's how you avoid that. Otherwise, deal with it, because I'm not going to try to hold back any spoilers because I'm talking about the damn final episode. Anyway, let me now get into my top 10 the top 10 best final episode series finales of all time. And like the worst one, was actually hard to come up with this list, to come up with 10 of them anyway, because there's actually not that many series finales, and a lot of them are kind of bland, so it was kind of hard to come up with good and bad ones. But anyway, I have done one of these top 10 series finales before, like 5 years ago or something like that, and this one is pretty different because, well, it's kind of similar, but it's pretty different because it's updated, and there's a lot of more recent shows in here. Anyway, let me now get into the top 10, starting with my number 10, Unending from Stargate SG-1. So this is a pretty interesting finale, and it's interesting to note that this wasn't the end of the story because they did a couple of straight-to-DVD movies after this, or 2 of them. They had planned to do a whole shitload, but then the MGM went under, so that ended. But this was still the final episode of the season, so it wasn't like wrapping up all the stories of the characters, like they didn't die or anything because they were going on to do these DVD movies. But it was a really fitting way to roll out the series. It was actually a really character-based episode, which I found interesting. It was basically about they were being hunted by the Ori. The whole Ori storyline wasn't very good, but that's not the point of this episode. The point of this episode is they froze themselves in time to prevent themselves from being destroyed, but they could not figure out a way to unfreeze time without dying. It literally took them decades to figure out how to get out of this situation. So they all grew old. They were basically, and there was romances formed and relationships formed. So it's basically a character story, which I thought was the perfect way to end SG-1. I actually found this really emotional. Whenever I hear the song, the Clearance Clearwater song. What is it? I don't remember what the song's called, but Have You Ever Seen the Rain? I always think of this episode because they used that song in this episode, and it was one of the most heartfelt, powerful montages I've seen. So this is actually a great way to end SG1. Anyway, let me now get into my number 9, which is Goodbye to Blue from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Now, this is a show I used to like a lot when I used to partake pretty often. And I've watched this show more recently sober, and it wasn't quite as funny or interesting. But so I was like, I kind of don't like the show as much as I used to. But I still really love this finale because even though this is like a silly kids cartoon, I thought this was one of the most clever series finales. And I always talk about this one to friends and whatnot. So basically, you know, it's a foster home for imaginary friends, a bunch of imaginary friends. The main character, Blue, who I kind of named my cat after, but it was kind of a Smashing Pumpkins song also. But anyway, Blue is moving, or his imaginary friend, his friend Mac, is moving. So they're moving to a different town. So they're not going to be together anymore, because he's going to stay behind with the Fosters. So it's like, we have to have one big adventure before you move out of town. And so every adventure Blue comes up with, like, this is what we need to do, is something they've already done in another episode. They're like, we did it in this episode, we did it this already. And he keeps naming things that we've seen before in other episodes. And they can't figure out what they want to do as a big adventure. So finally he's like, I got it! We'll jump the shark. So they have this imaginary French shark that they're gonna, and he's gonna get the skis out and jump over it. So obviously this was a beautiful metaphor. This was a beautiful way, and such a clever way for the writers to say, look, we're out of ideas. If this show keeps going, we're just gonna keep repeating ourselves over and over again, doing the same things we've already done. Or we're just going to jump the shark and try something ridiculous. So it's better to end the show now while we can go out on a high point. And that's, first of all, that they recognize that is brilliant, because a lot of shows, Dexter 24, excuse me, don't recognize that, and they keep going and going and going past their due date. So that's point number 1, that they recognize, hey, this is time to quit. And there's other shows on this list that also did that. But point number 2 is that they made the episode about that, which I thought, and a very sort of caked in metaphor, of course, which a lot of kids that probably went over their heads, but any adults watching this would be like, very clever. Anyway, so I always remember that for that. So now let me get into my number 8, which is Nice While It Lasted, Bojack Horseman. Now, unfortunately, Bojack Horseman is a case where the penultimate episode, The View from Halfway Down, if I was judging that episode, that would be towards the top of my list. In fact, I dare say it would be number 3 on my top 10 list. But unfortunately, I'm not judging that episode. I'm judging the finale, Nice While It Lasted, which wasn't quite as good as The View from Halfway Down. But that's technically the final episode. So that's the one I had to judge. Now, I love Bojack Horseman. If you haven't seen it, get off your ass and watch it right now. Well, get back on your ass, I guess, because you got to sit down and watch it. But whatever. It's an amazing show. I think it doesn't get nearly as much credit as it deserves. And so I thought the final season was a really fitting, powerful final season. But the last episode, a lot of people think it was really fitting because it was just contemplative. It was just basically people talking, and it was Bojack having a conversation with each of the 4 other main characters, one at a time, and that's it. There were no other supporting characters had any dialogue. in this episode is he talks to one character, then he talks to another, and then he talks to another, and they talk about the themes of the show and metaphors. How Todd says the show is art is what you take out of it, and then they basically his final conversation with Diane, which makes sense because the whole show started when he met her. So it's really about their relationship, and it's implying that that's the end of the relationship. Now, there's a theory out there I talked about, and when I did this, when I covered this video, I covered this finale in the video I did. There's a theory out there that Bojack is dead, and this is all his head. Personally, that makes me think better of this episode because I think the fact that because at the start of the episode they're like, oh, Bojack's actually alive, they had this death fake out, which I actually think hurts the previous episode, which was really powerful. So that kind of annoyed me. So if that theory makes me like it a bit better, even though that theory is probably not true. Although the writers pretty much said that the theory that he's actually dead in this episode wasn't their intention, but they're not. If that's what you want to believe, hey, that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. So I don't know. I'll leave it at that. Anyway, so still a great finale. Just not as good as the penultimate episode. Anyway, get into my number 7, which is Whenever You're Ready, The Good Place. Now, The Good Place is a show that I am kind of lukewarm on. I think is okay. Sometimes it really is a bit too ridiculous for me, and I don't really buy the premise. And particularly, you could tell that they kept like stretching things out to keep the story going. So I was happy to hear that they decided to cut it off season 4 because it was still somewhat acceptable, but if they tried to go any longer, it would be like, alright, you're just stretching things out and then we'll lose all interest. But that final episode was actually really good. It was like obviously one of the best final episodes because it's in my top 10, but I think it's a lot better than most of that show. Now, the show does have a lot of philosophical elements to it, which a lot of people point out, but even so, I think the narrative storytelling is a bit off. But this final episode, the thing I love about it the most is that there's no threat of the week. And that's the problem, I think, with a lot of previous episodes of The Good Place and a lot of shows. There has to be a threat of the week. You can't just have a contemplative character story where they look back on their lives. And that's what this final episode is. And I think this was very philosophical. It had a lot of deeper meanings. It was so satisfying. It was really emotional. It was intellectually satisfying. It was emotionally satisfying. Satisfying from a character standpoint. The dialogue was amazing. It brought you to tears and made you think at the same time. And it did this all by just having a character introspective instead of there was no threat. And I love that. So I did have to put this a bit ahead of Bojack Horseman, even though I think Bojack Horseman is a much better show than A Good Place. Finale-wise, this was better. So anyway, now getting to my number 6, which is 38 from Black Sails. So this was also a really great episode. Now, I had my reservations to the final season of Black Sails. I liked it well enough, but it did get a bit, I think it kind of lost the plot a bit, like season 3 and 4 kind of went in a different direction after season 2 and got a bit dark. And like all the characters started dying like crazy in the final season. But by the point we got to this final season, it was the showdown between, I'm sorry, I don't remember any of these characters' names. It's been years since I've seen this, but it was a showdown between the British captain naval guy and the pirate guy. Captain Flint, I do remember that. Anyway, so that was interesting enough. It was suspenseful enough, but what is so great about this episode that makes me... Because when I first saw this episode, if you go back and you watch my review of this episode I did right after it came out, I'm like, this finale sucks, I hate it. But then like 3 days later, I'm like, actually this finale is brilliant. Because I realized, spoilers, but I gave you the warning already, that it's ambiguous as to whether or not the main character, Captain Flint, died or survived at the end. And this was intentional, unlike the Bojack Horseman thing, which wasn't really intentional. They kind of intended to say, hey, he's alive. And I think it's brilliant that way. I think it's absolutely brilliant because it becomes more about the stories, like Jack Rackham at the end talks about the stories and the fables that you tell. So what actually happened really doesn't matter, and so it's up to the audience to decide whether or not Flint lived happily ever after with his lover, or if he was murdered in cold blood by his best friend. Personally, I like the murder in cold blood. Again, yeah, just like Bojack, I prefer the death scenario, but it's really open to your own interpretation of whether or not he's alive or not. And I think that was fucking brilliant. I think this was a really powerful finale. So anyhow, let me get into my number 5 best series finale of all time. Everybody Dies, House MD. I still love this. In fact, I did research for this. I read a whole bunch of top 10 worst and best finales, and I saw couple where this was in the worst list. I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with you? This finale was amazing. Now, the final season of House was it was not good. But we have a storyline at the very end of the season, maybe the last 4 episodes or something, about Wilson getting cancer and dying, cancer and being about to die. I only have a year left to live. And it accumulates in this episode, which I thought was fucking amazing, because House got himself arrested and he was going to have to go back to prison for a year, so that by the time he got out, his friend would be dead. And so in this scenario, it's where he's stuck in a house fire and he's contemplating suicide, and a lot of people from his that had died, that he knew that were on the show earlier that died, come to him in the vision and sort of talk to him about this and give different perspective, which I thought was a very powerful character introspective. And then at the end, they find that he does die, the house burns down, they have a funeral for him, and it was very touching, tear-jerking, and all the friends came and say something sad about House, and then Wilson walks out of the funeral to see House there waiting for him, still alive. It was very predictable. I knew, of course, that was going to happen, but it didn't make it any less powerful. It was so fitting of an end for this character who's been a sarcastic ass the entire 8 seasons. It's the most fitting thing in the world that he would fake his own death so he could go out on an adventure, hang out with his friend for the last year of his life, and they end the show with them riding motorcycles off together. It was just really heartwarming. To me, it's the most fitting ending for this show possibly could be. Screw the people who say this is bad. Anyway, let me now get into my number 4 best finale of all time, and that is The Book of Nora from The Leftovers. Now, this is yet another example, similar to Bojack Horseman, where the penultimate episode, if this was the penultimate episode, was it the most powerful man in the world and his identical twin brother, this would be my number 2, possibly even my number 1. But I'm not going off the penultimate episode, I'm just going off the finale, which this finale wasn't quite as powerful as that, but it was still really good. Now, I did my initial review of this, and I said it was one of the best finales ever, but kind of the opposite of Black Sails. Like a week later, I was like, actually, I changed my mind. It's not that good. But it's still good. I just don't think it's the best thing ever. It's more because it wasn't as interpretive as I thought it would be. It was kind of clear cut. It was about either she tells this story, Nora tells the story that she went to this other world where the 2% went to, and it was all different. They leave it up to your imagination again, kind of like Black Sails. Whether or not she's lying or not, that's all up to you. I thought it was even more interpreted than that, but it wasn't. So I thought so some of the stuff that happens early in the episode doesn't make sense, because I thought that they were dead and they were in this like weird sort of world that they go to in Leftovers, but that was ruled out, and I think that makes it less interesting because Lori's still alive, and I think a couple episodes earlier they heavily implied she committed suicide, so I was disappointed that she didn't. That's why I thought it was an afterlife, because I thought she had committed suicide. So that makes it less interesting to me, but it is kind of fitting for the Leftovers to end with more of a contemplative character story that jumps 20 years in the future and is about these characters reuniting. It is very touching, even though it's not quite as powerful as I hope it would be. It's really touching, and still, all in all, one of the better finales. It does it better than a lot of these other shows do, so hats off to the Leftovers. Anyway, let me now get into my number 3, which I thought would not still be number 3. This was also number 3 last time. I thought surely there's going to be something better, but apparently not, because my number 3 favorite finale of all time is still What You Leave Behind from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I've heard some people recently say bad things about this and think it was worse than Voyager's finale, which is the funniest thing I've ever heard. Don't make me laugh. But because this finale was really damn good. Now, there are issues with it. Vic Fontaine! Excuse me. Having a whole sequence on the half hour end of the episode where you're listening to a hologram going somewhere and having these cheesy montages where I have all the flashbacks of each character while they play the Frank Sinatra music. That was dumb! Come on! That was too much of a blatant attempt at melodrama, and they're trying too hard to pull the heartstrings that they could step back a little bit and get rid of that fucking singing hologram. Nobody likes you, Vic. Fuck you, Vic. But leaving that aside, this episode is amazing. It is the perfect send-off to this show. It's the way that it concludes the Dominion War in a dark, twisted fashion, which drives home the point which Star Trek and Deep Space Nine in particular is all about. War is bad. There's no the heroes come and save the day, and it's they won the day, and it's a heroic triumph. No! Millions and billions of freaking innocent people were slaughtered, and this Klingon asshole guy wants to drink wine over their dead bodies, and Sisko's like, no, this is a tragedy. War is not something to be celebrated. It's something to be avoided at all costs, and this is a very dark ending to it, and you got the particular character beats with Kira and Garrick being on Cardassia, and fucking Odo finally making peace with the founders and deciding to go back to them in order to try to change their minds. It was beautiful. And also the send off where Odo said goodbye to Kira and she went off. He went off with the founders. That makes me cry every time. I'm not ashamed to admit that. And the whole thing with Sisko going off to be with the gods. I mean, I never liked that storyline. It was a bit silly, but it was effective. It worked in this episode. So this is still my third favorite finale of all time. Anywhere, let me get into my number 2 favorite series finale of all time. Staying on the topic of Star Trek, All Good Things from Star Trek The Next Generation. Very close number 2. Again, I almost changed my mind and put this at number 1. Number 1, I think the Troy and Worf romance is what holds this back from being number 1. I'm sorry, but that's stupid. But the rest of this episode is amazing. It's a master class on how a series should end. It pays homage to the show that came before by having Picard time travel back to the pilot episode, and it integrates it with the present storyline, and it integrates it with the future storyline, which ironically the new show Picard has surpassed and changed, but whatever, that's totally different. But so it combines the present, the past, the future, and Picard has to make peace with these three things while trying to stop the whole universe from being destroyed by this anti-time anomaly, which you learn was just a trial for Q to test out his ability to see beyond simple things. And that's like the whole point of The Next Generation. And the whole point of Star Trek. Like, this episode was really thought-provoking. It was a great character story. You get character interactions between all the main characters. You get callbacks to the earlier series. And you get this great philosophical message that was at the heart of Star Trek and at the heart of The Next Generation about exploring the unknown. Almost perfect. I was going to say perfect, but then that Worf and Troy shit. So that's what keeps it from being number one. But almost perfect. But nearly perfect. One of the best finales of all time. So now let me get into my favorite series finale of all time, and that is Felina Breaking Bad. Now, Breaking Bad is kind of another similar situation where, well, not the penultimate episode, but the third to last episode, Ozymandias, was even better than this one. It was definitely the highlight, the best episode of the entire show. So some people might argue that the finale of Breaking Bad isn't all that amazing because it's not as good as Ozymandias, which was the height of the show. And I do agree Ozymandias was a better episode. But Felina was still an amazing finale, and it was still a perfect way to end this series. And the thing about Breaking Bad is it definitely went out on a high note. It's similar to what I said, where the show did not keep going on Dexter excuse me, way past its date where it should have ended years ago, 24 excuse me. It ended at a high note where it was still at its height, where it was still the best. And in fact, I contend that every season got better. Season 1 was good, but Season 2 was better. Season 3 was better than that. Season 4 was even better than that. And Season 5 was where it reached perfection. And it ended on this perfection. Now, again, I totally disagree that Ozymandias should have been the final episode. Totally disagree. It was an amazing episode, definitely the best episode of the show, but you needed the conclusion. You can't just end it there. And this was the perfect way to give closure that this show needed. It needed the closure where Walter White, it wasn't because Ozymandias was about Walter White's downfall. It's where everything fell apart for him. But you needed his character resolution, where he finally admitted, he learned that he fucked up. And he finally admits to Skyler that he wasn't doing this for the family, that he was doing it for himself. He's doing it because, and not just to Skyler, to himself as well. He finally admits to himself that he was doing it for him. He was doing it because he liked it, because he was good at it. And he devises a plan, not just to get back at those who wronged him, but also to free Jesse. And there's a lot of speculation about this, that maybe he wanted to kill Jesse or whatever because he did before. But I think one of the things that he learned is that Jesse was like a son to him and that he did him wrong. And plus Jesse was in an extremely dark place, being tortured, where his loved ones were being killed by these Nazi fucks. So he makes it right, and he in fact sacrifices himself to do it. It was a beautiful ending. It was a perfect way to tie up all of the main character relationships. Walt and Skyler, Walt and his son, Walt and Jesse, and that's what the show is about. You can't just end on his downfall. You have to end with this amazing closure, and that ends with Walter White's death, with him dying at his meth lab, because he has to admit that was what was important to him. And of course, like early in the episode, he figures out a way to trick the people, his old friends that made billions of dollars, to giving his money to his family without his family being aware of it, because if they were aware of it, they would never take the money. So that, of course, was awesome as well. So, perfect finale. My number one favorite finale, Breaking Bad. Anyway, that is it for my top 10 favorite series finales of all time. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to check out my channel as I cover many other shows such as Better Call Saul, Star Trek, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.